Did you know that the Vietnam War is the only war in history that wasn't fought using territorial lines? An intriguing fact, isn't it? This profound aspect sets the Vietnam War apart from most other conflicts in human history. Typically, wars are fought over land, over tangible borders. Armies clash on battlefields, each side seeking to push the other back to gain control over a piece of land. But the Vietnam War? It was different. It was a war without front lines, a war without clear territories. It was, in essence, an unseen war. The jungles of Vietnam did not offer the luxury of defined battle lines. Instead, the conflict was scattered, sporadic, and unpredictable. It was not about capturing and holding ground, but about winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The battlefield was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a constant state of flux. The traditional strategies of warfare were rendered ineffective in such a setting. It was a guerrilla war, a hit-and-run kind of warfare. The Viet Cong, the communist forces in the South, were experts in this. They would strike quickly and then disappear into the dense jungles or intricate tunnel systems, leaving the U.S. and Allied forces in a state of constant vigilance and uncertainty. And beyond the physical geography, this war was also fought on an ideological battleground. The struggle was between two ideologies, two ways of life: communism and democracy. The U.S., representing the democratic West, and North Vietnam, backed by communist powers like the Soviet Union and China, were not just fighting for land, they were fighting for the minds of the Vietnamese people. This was not a war of conquest, but a war of persuasion, a war of influence. It blurred the lines between civilian and soldier, between peace and war, between right and wrong. It was a war that challenged the very concept of what a war is and can be. Indeed, the Vietnam War was a war fought not over land, but over ideology. Ever heard about the domino theory? It was the main reason the U.S. got involved in Vietnam. The domino theory, a term coined during the Cold War, was rooted in the notion that a communist government in one nation would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states. Think of it like a row of dominoes standing on end. Tip one over and the rest follow suit. This theory was not just a hypothetical construct, but a serious concern for American policymakers. The United States, fresh from the Second World War, found itself in a new battle, this time against the spread of communism. The Cold War saw the world divided into two camps: the democratic capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The domino theory was born out of this tension. It was a belief that if one country in a region came under the influence of communism, then the surrounding countries would follow in a domino effect. Vietnam in Southeast Asia was seen as the next domino at risk. The fear of Vietnam becoming a communist nation and setting off a chain reaction in Asia was so great that it spurred the United States into action. The fear of the domino theory becoming reality was a leading factor in the United States' decision to engage in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the first to be broadcasted on television. It was a media war. The role of media, particularly television, during the Vietnam War was nothing short of transformative. For the first time in history, war was not an abstract concept discussed in newspapers or heard on radios. It was real, visceral, and it was happening right before the eyes of millions of viewers. Television brought the gruesome realities of war into the comfort of living rooms. Images of battles, casualties, and the suffering of innocent civilians were broadcasted nightly. This unfiltered access to the realities of war played a significant part in shaping public opinion. As the conflict dragged on, support for the war began to wane, with many questioning the justifications and the mounting cost in human lives. Beyond the public, the media also had a significant influence on policy. The images and stories relayed back home painted a stark contrast to the official narrative of progress and victory. This gap between the government's portrayal and the brutal reality shown on TV screens led to a credibility crisis known as the credibility gap. The media war was not just about information, it was about persuasion, influence, and power. It was a battlefield where perception was just as important as reality, where victory was measured not just in conquered territories, but in hearts and minds. Indeed, the Vietnam War was a war that unfolded in the living rooms of America. The Vietnam War holds the record for being America's longest war before the 21st century, a staggering 21 years from 1954 to 1975. That's almost a quarter of a century. For perspective, imagine a newborn child at the onset of the war. By the time the last helicopter left Saigon, that child would have been old enough to vote, drink, and even serve in the very conflict that spanned their entire lifetime. But why did it last so long? The answer is complex, layered with political, social, and military factors. The Vietnam War was a war of attrition where victory was measured not in territories captured, but in the number of enemy soldiers killed. This strategy, combined with the dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain, made for a long and drawn-out conflict. The war's duration had profound impacts on the American home front. It shaped a generation, defined an era, and left an indelible imprint on the national psyche. The war's length also had significant implications for policy and strategy, influencing how the United States approaches conflict to this day. Despite its length, the Vietnam War ended without a clear victor. The North Vietnamese forces and their Viet Cong allies claimed a political and military victory, while the United States withdrew, leaving a legacy of division and debate. The Vietnam War, a conflict that spanned over 2 decades, etched its name in history as the longest war in American history. Agent Orange, a herbicide and defoliant chemical, was one of the most deadly weapons used in the Vietnam War. The name might sound harmless, but don't let it fool you. Agent Orange was anything but. This chemical, a potent mixture of 2 herbicides, was employed extensively by the United States during the Vietnam War. Its primary use? To strip the dense jungles of Vietnam bare, leaving the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces with nowhere to hide. Yet the impact of Agent Orange was far more devastating than merely defoliating the landscape. The chemical was laced with a toxic compound called dioxin, known for its long-term health effects. The Vietnamese people, who relied heavily on their lush environment for sustenance and shelter, were suddenly exposed to this hazardous substance. The results were catastrophic. In the years following the war, health problems began to emerge among those exposed to Agent Orange. Cancer rates soared. Birth defects became commonplace. The Vietnamese population was ravaged by a host of illnesses, many of which were directly linked to their exposure to the deadly herbicide. But the Vietnamese weren't the only ones suffering. American troops, who were often in close proximity to the chemical's use, began to experience similar health issues. Veterans returned home carrying the invisible scars of war, many developing serious illnesses years after their service. The United States government was slow to acknowledge the link between Agent Orange and these health problems, leading to a long and contentious battle for recognition and compensation. The legacy of Agent Orange is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Vietnam War. It's a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of war, particularly the use of chemical weapons. The devastating effects of this deadly chemical are still felt today, more than half a century after the war ended. Agent Orange, a name that brings back haunting memories of the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong built a vast network of underground tunnels that played a key role in their warfare strategy. This subterranean labyrinth, a marvel of engineering under dire circumstances, was not just a means of transportation. It was the lifeblood of the Viet Cong's resistance efforts against the South Vietnamese and United States forces. Imagine, if you will, a spiderweb of tunnels, stretching over 250 kilometers, reaching from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. This was the Cu Chi Tunnel Network, one of the most infamous of its kind, but far from the only one. These tunnels were more than mere passageways. They were multi-tiered cities beneath the earth, complete with living quarters, hospitals, bomb shelters, and even theaters for entertainment. They facilitated communication and coordination, allowing the Viet Cong to mount surprise attacks and then disappear back into the earth before the enemy could react. But life in the tunnels was far from easy. Conditions were harsh and claustrophobic. The air was thin and hot, and diseases were rampant. Yet the Viet Cong soldiers and civilians persevered, driven by sheer determination and the will to fight for their cause. The tunnels were also booby-trapped with a variety of ingenious and often gruesome defenses to deter enemy intruders. From spike pits to venomous snakes, the dangers within these dark passages were as formidable as the soldiers who navigated them. Despite their significant strategic advantages, these tunnels also bore witness to the grim realities of war. They served as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which humans can go when pushed to the brink of survival. The U.S. forces tried to neutralize this threat through a variety of methods, including sending in specially trained soldiers known as tunnel rats. But the tunnels, like the Viet Cong themselves, proved resilient. These underground tunnels, a testament to human resilience and strategic warfare. They are a stark symbol of the Vietnam War, a silent echo of a conflict that reverberates through history. The Vietnam War sparked one of the most significant anti-war movements in U.S. history. As the war raged on thousands of miles away, its echoes reverberated throughout American society. The anti-war movement, a dynamic and multifaceted phenomenon, emerged as a direct response to this contentious conflict. The movement was a mixed bag of voices and perspectives. College students and academics, clergy and religious groups, civil rights activists, and even veterans returning from the front lines all joined the chorus demanding an end to the war. This broad coalition did not agree on everything, but they found unity in their opposition to the war. As the anti-war movement gained momentum, it exerted significant pressure on policymakers. Demonstrations, teach-ins, and acts of civil disobedience became common. The largest anti-war protest in history took place in November of 1969, when 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand peace. The impact of this movement was profound. It not only influenced public opinion and policy, but also reshaped the way Americans thought about war and foreign intervention. The anti-war movement became a symbol of resistance, of the power of the people to challenge their government, and of the potential for change. The Vietnam War, forever remembered as the war that divided America. The Vietnam War cost more than just lives. It had a staggering economic impact. This statement encapsulates the harsh reality of the war that spanned nearly 2 decades. The financial burden of the Vietnam War was colossal, with the costs reverberating through the fabric of American society for years after the final troops were withdrawn. The military expenses alone were astronomical. The United States government spent an estimated $170 billion on the war effort. That's about $1 trillion in today's money when adjusted for inflation. This was an enormous sum, representing a significant percentage of the nation's gross domestic product. But the financial toll didn't stop there. The war also had a profound impact on the American economy. To fund the war, the U.S. had to increase its borrowing, leading to higher interest rates and inflation. The war also diverted resources away from domestic programs. Money that could have been used for education, infrastructure, and social services was instead funneled into the war effort. Moreover, the war led to a decline in U.S. productivity. Millions of young men were sent overseas, depleting the nation's workforce. This loss of human capital, combined with the economic instability caused by the war, resulted in a decade of economic stagnation. In addition to these direct costs, there were also indirect costs. The war led to a loss of trust in government as the public grew disillusioned with the government's handling of the war. This loss of trust had long-term consequences, undermining public confidence in government for years to come. And let's not forget the human cost. The lives lost, the families torn apart, the physical and psychological trauma suffered by the veterans. These costs, while not quantifiable in monetary terms, were just as real and just as devastating. So when we talk about the cost of the Vietnam War, we're not just talking about dollars and cents. We're talking about a toll that was felt on multiple levels: economic, social, and human. The Vietnam War, a costly affair in more ways than one. The aftermath of the Vietnam War had far-reaching consequences both for Vietnam and the United States. This conflict, which spanned over 2 decades, left an indelible mark on the nations involved and the world at large. Vietnam, a country ravaged by war, faced a daunting task of rebuilding. Millions of its citizens had to grapple with the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. The war also had a profound effect on U.S. foreign policy. It brought about a shift in the way the United States engaged with the world, leading to a more cautious approach to military interventions. The Vietnam Syndrome became a term coined to describe the American public's wariness towards foreign involvement after the trauma of Vietnam. The war's aftermath, filled with a sense of loss and lessons learned, continues to shape the socio-political landscapes of the nations involved. The Vietnam War, a war whose echoes are felt even today. Despite its devastation, the Vietnam War taught us valuable lessons. It demonstrated the significance of cultural understanding in international conflicts. The United States, a country founded on democracy, found itself in a quagmire against a nation driven by nationalism and communism. Understanding these cultural nuances could have drastically altered the course of the war. Moreover, the war underscored the necessity for clear military objectives. Without a defined endgame, the U.S. found itself entangled in a protracted conflict with no clear path to victory. This lack of direction not only drained resources but also led to a loss of public support. The war also highlighted the power of public opinion. The anti-war movement that arose from the conflict became a powerful force, shaping policy and leading to significant changes in the U.S. government's handling of foreign affairs. The Vietnam War, a grim chapter in history that continues to teach us important lessons.